What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Alright, so I have almost exclusively never talked about the Ultimate Universe, and it's not because I didn't like it, it's simply because of the fact that there was just so much to talk about in the main Marvel Universe. For whatever reason, I just couldn't find the time to do it. But now, since there's so much stuff going on in the Marvel Universe, or at least so much stuff that I've covered before, we're in All New, All Different Marvel, which is an amalgamation, a combination of the Ultimate Universe and the Earth 616 universe from before Secret Wars. I figured, why not touch on the Ultimate Universe? At the very least, kind of dip my toe in the water here. And so, since we're bringing back discussions on like teams and characters and concepts and so on, I figured I'd try my hand at Ultimate Universe and really talk about the origin of mutants, of the Incredible Hulk, the Super Soldier program, that kind of thing, all kind of rolled into one. Now, the cool thing about this is that this actually comes to us from a 5-issue limited series called Ultimate Origins, but there's kind of a caveat here. The Ultimate Universe was really launched with like Spider-Man, and that makes sense just because of the fact that Spider-Man is like the face of Marvel Comics, and so if they were going to bring in the Ultimate Universe, they would start with Peter Parker himself. Now, unlike the Marvel 616 universe, which delves a lot with mysticism and fantasy and all kinds of crazy cosmic entities and stuff, the Ultimate Universe was designed to be more grounded, more realistic. And so that's why, for those of you guys who have been watching a lot of the Marvel movies, a lot of that content takes from the Ultimate Universe because the two are almost synonymous in terms of how characters are depicted to us and in terms of how events would unfold. That's why I've always said, if Marvel were to get the rights back to mutants, they would logically start with Wolverine, like we'll see here, and then just allow mutants to go from there. It'd be the most reasonable course of action because the origin of mutants in the Ultimate Universe can be introduced at any point in time. It's not really contextual based on a particular set of circumstances or a particular part of the timeline. So what this does is this initially picks up with the Battle of Tenarue, I think is how you pronounce it, in 1942. Now, the Battle of Tenarue is also called the Battle of Crocodile Creek, stuff like that. It's just a conflict between the Allied forces of the US and Japan, but the reason why this is important is because this is the United States introducing their first quote-unquote super soldier. Now, I use that term loosely because this guy as a super soldier is considered to be a super soldier by name only. He doesn't possess any incredible feats. Instead, he's actually shot in the middle of trying to rally the troops, and his blood is spread all over the American flag. Now, this is one of the reasons why I say that Ultimate Origins is so grounded, because of the fact that it ties heavily into World War II in terms of how realistic it was. World War II was a war of propaganda, to be quite honest. I mean, it was a war on the front of people actually going overseas and fighting, but it was a total war effort. And what that means is all facets of American society were tied into it. You were conserving your resources. Women were working in mills instead of men in order to keep the production process going. That's why Rosie the Riveter kicked off, and it ushered in a new era of women actually going to work in the post-World War II landscape. It was a war in terms of media, so newspapers were touting pro-American propaganda. Comic book superheroes back during World War II, Superman, Captain America, Name of the Submariner, Batman, Aquaman, they were all fighting against the Axis powers. Not all of them used the names of Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler and Hirohito, but they were fighting against the Axis forces. All facets of the socio-economic landscape of the United States were involved in World War II in some form or fashion in support of America. What this tells us is it was much the same way that the United States, in order to bolster the morale of the soldiers, would introduce a super soldier who could basically go into these conflicts that were almost guaranteed to be losses, bolster the morale of the American soldiers in the hopes that they would actually pull it out. The problem is that with this super soldier dead and his blood all over the American flag, that image is spread to the furthest corners of the world, and it's been a huge moral blow to the American forces and to the Allied forces. And so things like this, you know, propaganda wins or loses wars. If the people who are fighting don't believe in the cause they're fighting for, then they're going to lose hope halfway through and they're more likely to lose the conflict. But if there's a symbol for them to rally behind, at least in the context of this story, then they'd be more likely to win. And that's what President Roosevelt goes for. President Roosevelt says, we don't need to use super soldiers in the form of propaganda. What we need are actual super soldiers. Now, your first inclination here will be to say, well, enter Steve Rogers. Nope. This is one of the huge differences between the Ultimate Universe and the main Marvel Universe. The first super soldier in the Ultimate Universe is Nick Fury, and that's one of the coolest things about this. Now, what this story does is it shifts over to the Allied invasion of Sicily as we were making our way across Europe, and it actually picks up with Wolverine, it picks up with Nick Fury, and it picks up with Fisk. Now, keep in mind, this is not Wilson Fisk, that is to say, the Kingpin. This is actually his grandfather, I think, or his great-grandfather or something along those lines, but these guys are actually just looting stuff. That's all they're doing. It's not some grandiose thing. They're just looting. This is one of the other reasons why the Ultimate Universe was kind of cool, was because not all the American soldiers who were fighting overseas were legit. Some of them were going in and just stealing stuff and taking it back home with them. In truth, there were a lot of heads that were being turned to this just because of the fact that, people were like, hey, look, as long as we win, we don't care. A lot of people didn't want to be there. They're like, we'll just give orders, do whatever it is that you do, as long as you don't commit heinous acts. Not to mention the Geneva Accords weren't signed until like 1954, I think. And so as far as I'm aware, laws on torture, different things like that didn't really exist as far as this goes around. But at the very least, it's just people just stealing stuff. But of course they are caught by the military police. And the result is that they're actually taken to undisclosed locations. Now, Nick Fury's taken to one place and Wolverine's taken to another. And this is actually really, really important. And the reason why is because when Nick Fury's taken to this prison, it's really more of a prison of experimentation. And so what happens is we effectively have Project Rebirth. Now, in the main Marvel Universe, Project Rebirth, the first experiment, well, there was kind of like a Patient Zero before Steve Rogers. That was a retcon, and that doesn't exist. That was some terrible storytelling. And so because of that, we do not acknowledge that. As far as we know, in the main Marvel Universe, Steve Rogers was the first super soldier. But, Nick Fury being brought here, again, is he's kind of coming in as test subject number 23. Now, we're not given a whole lot about the previous test subjects. All we know is that, of course, up to this point, they've all basically died. Their bodies have exploded or something along those lines, but they weren't able to withstand the onslaught of rays and transfusions and so on and so forth. Instead, Nick Fury is basically given this serum, and there's no protuberances, there's no tumors, there's no growth, no nothing. Instead, he immediately becomes a super soldier. His body starts growing in size, he becomes stronger, and the result is he actually not only frees himself, he frees everybody else, all these other prisoners who are being held captive. Now, what this does is it basically, the members of Project Rebirth allow him to leave, because for them, they're interested in the research, they're not really interested in the man. All they really want to do is know how to duplicate their serum. The reason why this is important, though, is because what this did is create a mad dash, because the United States were the first people to create the super soldier in the Ultimate Universe, and so it was like this space race, so to speak, among all the other first world nations where they wanted to have their own super soldiers. So what we do is we jump to Alberta, Canada, and we pick up with Wolverine. Now, at this point, he's currently being experimented on, but of course he's able to break free, he starts shooting people up, but then he's shot and he actually heals, and so then they take him back. Now, this is again the first indication of mutants, and what we learn is that within this Weapon X project, according to Dr. Cornelius, as he's talking to Dr. Colcord, I believe it is, what he says is that as they were experimenting on Wolverine, and when they were attempting to turn him into their own super soldier, they discovered that if they modified the genome or the genome within his body, that powers manifested, basically his healing factor. And so what they say is if we take this formula, so to speak, and we basically disperse it across the world, we'll literally save humanity, because a time will come when humanity is going to go extinct or something along those lines, any number of factors. But if they essentially spread this across the world, they'll basically create mutants. And so that's what happened here. Mutants in the Ultimate Universe were manufactured, and Wolverine was Patient Zero. That's why I say the introduction of mutants in the Marvel Cinematic Universe could be done at any point in time. All you have to do is get the rights to the X-Men, that comes with Wolverine, you introduce him, you throw him into the Weapon X project, they discover the genome that if modified gives people powers, it's spread throughout the world, boom, you got mutants in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. To me, it makes the most logical sense. Either that, or Marvel's going to have to explain how it is that mutants have been here the entire time, and no one knew. So, so it makes the most sense to me that they would go that route. Now from here, this is when we start to get into some of the interesting things, and I actually held off on this for a second because I wanted to talk about this once we got to it, but we pick up with the Fantastic Four. Now, Ultimate Origins was written sometime after the introduction of Fantastic Four and the introduction of Spider-Man, and so by the time this story came around, their origin stories were already fleshed out, and so it made no sense to go through and begin going through their origin stories again. Instead, they're just here. Now, we can go through and cover Ultimate Fantastic Four, and I think Benny over Comic Storian is covering Ultimate Spider-Man, or is going to be sometime in the next little bit, if he hasn't already. So I told him I'd stay hands off that. We try not to cross over on each other and kind of mess each other over when it comes to content, but unless it's something like really huge that happens, unless news drops that like Marvel got the rights to the X-Men, well then everybody's making videos on that. That's just how that is. But with regards to this, the Fantastic Four have their own thing, and we may or may not touch on that. It's actually kind of a cool story. Fox screwed it up with their movie, but what happens, or at least at the very least, is that the Fantastic Four have been summoned to what amounts to a Project Pegasus facility. Now, Project Pegasus is actually a really cool situation. It's this organization that quite literally just exists to grab all these different artifacts that may or may not present global dangers to the world overall, also have unique origins or unknown origins, but they're basically powerful objects of a destructive or powerful nature, and the idea is to basically keep them in this facility. Now, of course, when Reed Richards gets in here, he's like, are you guys crazy? You guys have these objects that could lay waste to life on the planet Earth, and there's multitudes of these all here. What if something were to explode? What if a villain got in here and decided to start activating them all? Like, you know, this is a terrible situation. Now, of course, this entire tour is being brought by Carol Danvers, and that's why I say things are a little bit different here, because Carol Danvers is not Captain Marvel in the Ultimate Universe, but this is a homage of sorts to her first introduction. That is to say, when Carol Danvers first appeared in the main Marvel Universe, she was stationed at Cape Citadel, I think it was, and she was just kind of like an Air Force pilot, I think, or somebody high-ranking in the military. It wasn't until later on, when she was exposed to the Psych Magnetron, that she basically had the powers of Marvel copied over to her, and then she became Captain Marvel. So again, I've got videos explaining her history if you guys are interested in that, but in any event, what we learn here is that there are basically like these obelisks or these artifacts that have just begun activating all over the world, and no one really knows why. Now from here, we jump back to 1942 and we pick up with Steve Rogers, because I know a lot of people are probably waiting on this. In the Ultimate Universe, Steve Rogers is much like what you saw in the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the Marvel Movie Universe, which is to say he was a very weak guy, he was not that strong, but he had a passion to fight on behalf of the Allied forces in World War II. One major difference here though is that he's actually engaged to a woman named Gail. Now again, one of the big things here is that every single time he went and tried to apply to join the US military or join the US Army, he was always turned down for any number of reasons, because he was too scrawny, he was too emaciated, he was probably anemic, he just didn't have what was necessary to be an effective soldier. But much like what we saw in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, instead of Dr. Abraham Erskine coming along and saying, hey, I want to make you part of the Super Soldier Project, instead, he's actually brought over by Dum Dum Dugan. Now again, for those of you guys who are kind of getting into this, Dum Dum Dugan in the main Marvel Universe was part of Nick Fury's Howling Commandos. Here in the Ultimate Universe, that was not part of the case. He was just a guy working in the military, but he's brought forward to Dr. Abraham Erskine. And Abraham Erskine says, we want to bring you in to Project Rebirth, to the Super Soldier program, because of your conviction, because you're what we're looking for as the perfect soldier, in the sense that you're a true believer. You know, you believe in the cause of the Allied forces. You want to take down the Axis forces. You're exactly what we're looking for to lead our guys. And so as he goes through the process, it plays out pretty much almost identical to the Super Soldier program that we saw in the main Marvel Universe. There's a few differences in terms of equipment that's being used, but he's subjected to the entire formula. And of course, he emerges as the Captain America Steve Rogers that we're so familiar with. The problem with this is that, again, much like the main Marvel Universe, there's a Nazi spy among their ranks. They are able to shoot Steve Rogers, but when Dr. Abraham Erskine runs to help, he's actually killed in the process as well. And so again, much like all these situations, it creates for a very similar outcome to what we saw in the main Marvel Universe, but not the exact same. But something else to also note here is that one of these obelisks is watching the entire event unfold. And that's really how all these things go. There's going to be a lot of major events that progress throughout the story, and that obelisk is going to be there to watch them all. Now, at this point, we kind of fold things out. We kind of cover things out with Steve Rogers, which is to say that he encounters President Roosevelt. Roosevelt says, hey, we need you. You got to fight on our behalf. Rogers says, yeah, that's not a problem. And he actually leaves his fiancée, Gail, and ends up taking off to fight in World War II. Now, at this point, we transition back to the Fantastic Four, and they're continuing to monitor these obelisks. That's kind of the underground current that's going on here. Not only that, Carol Danvers gets a call saying that this one obelisk that is, suddenly turned on is not the only one. Instead, these artifacts are activating all across the world, and no one really understands why, and no one really understands how. They just know that they are. Now, at this point, we pick back up again with Wolverine in the past, and we're actually introduced to Eric Lyncher. Now, this is where things get a little bit murky here, because Marvel doesn't do a great job of explaining what happened here, and I imagine they kind of left it ambiguous, but this was also tied into the Ultimatum event. I think they came along and explained some of the stuff that went on here, but for the sake of making this video make sense, we're gonna go ahead and grab that and throw it in. Essentially what happens is Eric Lyncher, of course, arrives, and we don't really know how it is that he got here, at least not initially, but discovers that Wolverine's being experimented on by Weapon X. What we also learn is that his mother is part of the project. Now, of course, he does free Wolverine, and he actually kills his mom in the process using his powers over magnetism, but to tie in a little bit of Ultimatum, what happened is somewhere along the line between when this gene was discovered, or the ability to manipulate this genome was discovered in Wolverine, and this moment right here when Eric Lyncher shows up, Weapon X had effectively found a way to turn this into like an aerosol, or turn this into a substance and disperse it into the atmosphere. And so what it did was begin automatically modifying the genomes of existing humans that had the potential to become mutants, and then turn them into mutants. And so that's why Eric Lyncher has powers right now. Again, Marvel doesn't connect those dots too well right here. They kind of leave things ambiguous a bit. We don't really know how we got from A to B, but by virtue of that quick explanation, that's pretty much what happened. Of course, Eric Lyncher killing his mother was only the first step in his life of becoming more involved in mutants, because what happened is at the same time that Eric Lyncher was developing his powers over magnetism, Charles Xavier was developing his powers of telepathy. Now, in the midst of one of his lectures, again, this is back before Charles Xavier lost his ability to walk, But in the midst of one of his lectures, he's suddenly met by Magneto. Now again, I'd like you guys to notice here a lot of the similarities between these discussions, between the way these characters are depicted and the various movies that we've seen, because a lot of people look at the main Marvel line of comics and they say, well, that's how Magneto and Charles Xavier met. Why aren't the movies the same way? Fox is drawing largely from the Ultimate Universe. They're doing their own little thing here and there, but the Ultimate Universe is where a lot of the movies are based on, because it makes sense. If you're going to make a movie based on comic book characters, then make movies based on comic book characters that are rooted in the most realistic way possible, which was basically the Ultimate Universe. And so what happened here is that we have Charles Xavier communicating with Eric Lyncher telepathically, but Eric says, look, your work, your study on the mutant genome, your study on how mutants work, on how our powers manifest and so on, has struck an interest, and he effectively wants to start working with him. Now, this is a stark difference from the main Marvel Universe in terms of how the two of them met, because they basically met in what was essentially a bar fight. A bar fight was how Magneto and Charles Xavier met one another, but their storyline played out almost identical in terms of their curiosity about how their powers work, what it is that they could and couldn't do, but also the idea that while Charles Xavier could communicate to a degree telepathically to Magneto, Magneto couldn't really like read his mind per se. And so the funny thing about this was that it seemed as though Eric Lyncher was kind of blocking him out, blocking out his powers. A lot of this is probably just tied, due to his abilities in terms of how they formed, but at the very least, it created a friendship between the two of them, and they actually started working together with one another in order to understand how far-fetched this power went in terms of, mutants being activated, so on and so forth. But their journey actually ends up taking them to the Savage Land. Now, the reason why it takes them to the Savage Land is because this is kind of this hideout for mutants in the Ultimate Universe. Now, ironically enough, this is actually drawing on the Age of Apocalypse, which is a really, really cool thing to do here. For those of you guys who don't know and didn't read Age of Apocalypse, that was a story where, of course, Legion went back in time, wanted to kill Magneto to make his father Charles Xavier's life easier. Xavier jumped in the way, he was killed instead, and Apocalypse took that chance to take over the world because the X-Men as we knew them were never traditionally formed. And so what happened is Magneto was left to kind of lead what he could find of the X-Men, and this led to Apocalypse taking over North America in its entirety. Now, those people who were able to escape North America, mutants and human alike, either fled to Europe where they joined the Human High Council and the various forces of the Resistance working against Apocalypse, or they took off to the Savage Land where they were protected by Cain Marko, the Juggernaut, who had basically become a monk. But this aspect ties very similarly into it in the sense that mutants are kind of taking a refuge, they're kind of taking a safe haven for themselves. What this also does is it allows, again, this indication that this obelisk is watching all this unfold. They're watching these mutants come into existence, manifest, and eventually come together. Now, at this point, we switch back over to Nick Fury. This is not wildly important, but it is important to a degree in the sense that there are a lot of questions being asked of Nick Fury in terms of what he recalls about Project Rebirth, how all that stuff worked, how he got his powers, so on and so forth, or his abilities anyway. But what Nick Fury does is, again, right now, as a director of S.H.I.E.L.D., transitioning back to the present day, what he says is people are going to continue to try to search for this super soldier serum. And so what he does is he presents, the Fantastic Four and a handful of others with a vial of blood. Now, he doesn't say who it's from. He doesn't say that it's from him. He just says, here's the blood of a person who has successfully been able to endure the super soldier project. And so he basically assigns them with the idea of finding a way to crack the code to create super soldiers, not necessarily to make them now, but on the off chance they would need them later on. And so this is actually him just kind of stockpiling the necessity of super soldiers, again, in case some kind of a massive conflict takes place. Now, this is when we start to get into the origin of Bruce Banner, the origin of the Incredible Hulk, because Bruce Banner is one of the best scientists, especially when it came to like biology and so on, had actually begun going through and cracking this code and doing a pretty good job at it. The problem was that when it came down to it and it was time to test and see whether or not it actually worked, despite the fact that it was against the rules, he tested it on himself. Now, the other half of this is Richard and May Parker, the parents of Peter Parker. They were part of this project in trying to crack the super soldier serum and find a way to create more super soldiers. The issue is that the Incredible Hulk's origin goes hand in hand in the sense that when he injects himself with it, he immediately freaks out and transforms into the Hulk, which seems to result in the deaths of Richard and May Parker. And so again, this is one of the crazy situations in the Ultimate Universe where we have things that are starkly different from the main Marvel universe. So this is one of the reasons why the Ultimate Universe is really kind of cool, because things cross over in a way that you wouldn't really expect. Now, when Bruce Banner turns into the Hulk and kind of begins to go on a rampage, he actually sees Peter Parker as a baby, and it kind of snaps him back to who he is, brings him back to reality, and he goes back into his normal human form. The response is that Nick Fury loses his shit. and begins beating the hell out of him, really kind of beats him unconscious. But of course, Banner's taken prisoner, and this leads to his escape. When we had talked about, Wolverine versus the Incredible Hulk, when we had done that story, this eventually led into his escape, which kind of fast forwarded to the current moment and so on and so forth. But Nick Fury effectively takes Peter Parker as his own, and this will eventually lead to Peter Parker being given to Aunt May in order to be raised by whatever family he has left. But from here, we basically jump back to the Fantastic Four again, and they're continuing to examine these obelisks, but then we have Susan Storm suddenly taken over by one. She's effectively possessed, and speaking through her, what it tells us is that it is essentially a Watcher, that this is the Ultimate Universe equivalent of Uatu the Watcher. Now, these are where things get a little bit murky, because when it comes to the Ultimate Universe in relation to the multiverse in Marvel Comics, Marvel kind of dances around things a little bit. For example, there's an end zone and there's a negative zone, and they never really kind of jumped between those two things. It was kind of weird and kind of murky waters. In the multiverse, there's only one negative zone and anybody can access it. But then you had the end zone, which was like a whole different location than the negative zone. And so as far as I'm aware, it was a really weird situation. But in the multiverse, we only have one Uatu the Watcher. That was established in Original Sin, that Uatu the Watcher was looking at all these different universes. And in fact, in the What If line of stories where we are given these events from alternate realities, it was always Uatu the Watcher that brought him to us and said, hey, I've been looking at this alternate universe and I thought you might dig it. Here's the story on it. Like, what if Deadpool was possessed by the Venom symbiote, different things like that. But what she says, or at least what Uatu the Watcher says through Susan Storm, is that there's a major event coming. There's a major crisis coming, that there's an awakening of mutants all across the world. There are people who are gaining superpowers through other factors as well. Whether it is Spider-Man being bitten by a radioactive spider, whether it is the Fantastic Four and their exposure to cosmic rays, whether it is Banner experimenting on himself with a super soldier serum, whatever the reason, people are beginning to emerge at a much faster rate than they were before in terms of abilities. And all these people with all these powers and all these agendas on the earth is going to lead to a massive conflict. And when it does, there's going to need to be someone that can basically make sure order is maintained, that can return to status quo. And so what happens is Marvel basically begins wrapping up all loose ends. And that's one of the cool things about the Ultimate Universe, is with this Ultimate Origins, things are starting to get wrapped up. We effectively have Nick Fury traveling to the Weapon X facility and discovering that all these people, all these individuals are being experimented on. More so than that, Nick Fury also, begins speaking with Cornelius and is effectively told that Weapon X created mutants, that mutants are man-made. They're not some inherent thing. They're not, some kind of messiah group. They're basically created by people. Now, Nick Fury comes to the realization that if this ever hit the public eye, if this ever became public to the world, it would lead to a massive amount of backlash against mutants, because people are already terrified of them in the Ultimate Universe. This is one of the big things with Ultimatum. People are terrified of mutants in the Ultimate Universe, and that if it's revealed that mutants are created by humans, humans will say, we created you, we can kill you. And so it would literally lead to all kinds of deaths. It would lead to, I guess my favorite phrase in the world, it would lead to humanity cutting a swath through the mutant population. But it would ultimately lead to a multitude of different problems. So Nick Fury says, if this is the case, if these individuals create a mutant kind and they're not remorseful, the only thing we can do is kill them all. And so he says, cleanse everything, cleanse it all, kill every single doctor from the Weapon X project that's here, innocent or not, kill them all. We're going to eliminate all existence of the Weapon X project in its entirety from the face of the earth. The only exception to this is he goes into a room, and this is one of the huge kickers, he goes into a room and he discovers T'Challa. He discovers the Black Panther from the main Marvel Universe, or at least the Ultimate Universe version of him. He was effectively created as a mutant by the Weapon X project. And so, of course, he basically takes him away, sharing some kind of kinship. He removes him and destroys the Weapon X project with the rest of the SHIELD forces. And so what this does is this kind of begins to, again, wrap up some loose ends, begin to tie things to a close. And we ultimately have this final conflict between Charles Xavier and Magneto. What we're told is that, again, back when they were in the Savage Land, the two of them had a wildly different view of things. Much like the main Marvel Universe, Charles Xavier believed in a peaceful coexistence between humans and mutants. He believed it was possible, that again, because they don't know the truth, that mutants would be able to come together and they would be able to work alongside humanity. Magneto has a very different view. The difference here is that Magneto's view is not just homo superior. Magneto's view is very close to the views of William Stryker. And what I mean here is that in the main Marvel Universe, William Stryker was a religious fundamentalist who believed it was his mission from God to kill mutants. Magneto in the Ultimate Universe is a little bit different in terms of what he says here that no, humans and mutants cannot live together. We were given these powers from God, and it's not your place to challenge God's views. Not only that, because we were given these powers by God, and because these powers make us more capable than humans, it means we were destined to rule humans. And so again, this is very extreme view. This is very extremist perception. But again, it takes Magneto and Charles Xavier back to the status quo of the two of them being enemies based on their own views when it comes to mutant kind's relation with the rest of humanity. And so ultimately, this Watcher, jumping back to the Fantastic Four, this Watcher basically says a herald will be chosen that will have the power necessary to help set things back to normal in order to combat all these insane amount of powers. And so what we learn is that this Harbinger that's basically been chosen, this herald, comes in the form of Rick Jones. With that being said, if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the subscribe button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video and you want to see more Ultimate Universe stuff, make sure you hit the like button and leave a comment down below. Let me know what you guys think about Ultimate Universe, because I imagine it has mixed feelings. I know some love it, some hate it. I'm kind of curious. And yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.